Hi folks, welcome to our remote class. This class is going to consist of 3 videos that I want you to watch, and each video has a question that you need to answer and submit via Twen. You can submit all of them together as one document, or you can submit them individually, whichever you find more convenient. Though I'd prefer that you submit them all together if you can, just because that's fewer documents for me to go through. In terms of the cases that I asked you to read for today, you should know that I picked cases just as examples. There's nothing particularly special about these cases. They're just from New York, and they deal with adverse possession. They're not like Supreme Court cases where you need to remember the name. They just explain various aspects of adverse possession. Okay, so here's what we're going to do today. Okay, we're going to go through the elements of adverse possession, and then we're going to talk about how to interpret them. So we're going to focus today particularly on what does it mean to have a claim of right, what is actual possession, and when is possession open and notorious. Now, another thing to keep in mind for understanding adverse possession is that these elements of adverse possession get sort of sliced and diced and mixed a little bit. So sometimes you'll see courts saying there are 5 elements. Sometimes you'll see courts saying there are 4 elements. Don't get too hung up on that. Don't get too hung up on whether or not courts sort of say actual and exclusive possession rather than having actual possession and exclusive possession be separate elements. And then next class, we will return to adverse possession and we'll talk about what does it mean for adverse possession to be for the statutory period, and we'll look at the concept of tacking, and then we'll talk about the exceptions in the statute to the adverse possession rule and how those work. So first of all, let's just be really clear about the consequences of adverse possession, right? The Brand v. Prince case is very blunt. The necessary effect by barring the real owner's right to recover his property is to extinguish the real owner's title and make absolute the title of the wrongful possessor. Right? This is about transferring ownership from the record owner, the person who's the real owner, until the adverse possession period runs, and transferring that ownership to a new owner. Okay, so why have this doctrine? Right? Why have adverse possession? There are a bunch of different rationales, and we're going to walk through them one by one. But the thing to understand about adverse possession is that it is a statute of repose. The adverse possession statute is the cutoff point at which the original owner, the record owner, can no longer eject somebody who has trespassed. So the adverse possessor enters as a trespasser, just like we were talking about in State v. Shack, and just like we were talking about in Jacques, right? The adverse possessor enters as a trespasser, but after the adverse possession period has ended, the original owner no longer has the right to eject them. At that point, the trespasser becomes the owner. So there are a bunch of different rationales, and conveniently enough for us, Justice Holmes described most of them. As we look at what Justice Holmes had to say about adverse possession, I want you to keep in mind the question of, is property theft? That's sort of where we started the class, and now we're back to it. Justice Holmes describes a bunch of rationales, right? One, he talks about over time, you lose evidence. Remember, Justice Holmes was writing a long time ago. It has a lot more salience before the era of computers, before the era of the internet, of storing documents, when everything had to be entered by hand into ledgers. There was concern that over time, the reliability of the written record might degrade. Papers could be lost. Books could catch fire or be eaten by rats or destroyed in some other fashion. And that, therefore, the record of who owned property would be lost through the mists of time. And if there's one thing you will see in this class of property, it's that the law always wants to know who owns property. Super important that there be clarity. So this rationale, right, the loss of evidence, is a combination of an administrative rationale and a utilitarian rationale, and maybe even a little bit of a statute of limitations rationale. Then Justice Holmes goes on to indicate that sometimes the desirability of peace is what matters, right? Over time, you want there to be peace and clarity. That's the essence of a statute of limitations in the first place. But he asks, why is peace more desirable after 20 years than before? Right? Why is this that's rationale of the desirability for peace, for repose, for closure, more desirable as time goes on? Now, one thing to notice here is that Justice Holmes is writing about 20 years as the statutory period. In New York, the statutory period is 10 years. In some places, in Idaho, I think it's 4 years. So this is an area where the elements of adverse possession will be different in different states. You want to make sure that whatever state you are in, that you check how the law works in that specific state, because while the mechanics are very similar, the specifics will be different state to state. And then Justice Holmes says what is probably his most often quoted statement about adverse possession. Sometimes it is said that if a man neglects to enforce his rights, he cannot complain if after a while there should be another phrase in there. If after a while the state follows his example. Okay, again, this is something you've run across elsewhere in law school, this notion that you can't sleep on your rights, right? And that is what statute of limitations do. They cut off what would otherwise be valid claims after a certain amount of time has passed. You can say it's about peace. You can say it's about clearing away stale claims. You can say it's about allowing society to move forward or whatever. But I think Justice Holmes has a point that if you sit on your rights, at some point, you really can't complain if the state follows your example. Now, one more Justice Holmes quote, and then we'll be done with him. And he doesn't show up very often in property, just so you know. And this is a quote that we looked at the very first class when we were talking about why we have property rules in the first place. A thing which you have enjoyed and used as your own for a long time takes root in your being and cannot be torn away without your resenting the act and trying to defend yourself, however you came by it. The law can ask no better justification than the deepest instinct of man. Now, this is a personhood, much more of a personhood justification for the doctrine of adverse possession. And you will see all of these justifications sort of trotted out in various aspects in the case law. So I have a question for you, and that is that I want you to submit via Twen. And that is, which of these rationales do you, if any, do you find persuasive? And do you see any additional arguments, particularly any additional efficiency arguments that might be made in favor of adverse possession? Okay, so answer those questions. Obviously, you can stop the video if you want to, but you don't need to. You can do it at your own time. Now, let's move on and look at the New York adverse possession statute. Okay, and this defines, first of all, here's the definition of who is an adverse possessor. Okay, a person is an adverse possessor of real property when they occupy the real property of another person in a manner that would give the owner a cause of action for ejectment. Ejectment is a common law term for a civil action to recover possession of or title to land. So in order to be an adverse possessor, you have to do something that would give the owner the right to eject you. Okay, and again, as we said, adverse possession is a statute of repose. Once the adverse possession period has passed, the owner no longer has the right to eject you. So Section 5012 of the New York law, adverse possession statute, says that an adverse possessor gains title to the occupied real property upon the expiration of the statute of limitations for an action to recover real property. You can see there's an interlocking definition here. Adverse possessor gains title at the expiration of the statute of limitations for an action to recover real property, and a person becomes an adverse possessor when they act in a manner that would give the owner a cause of action for ejectment. So acting in the manner that would give an owner a cause of action for ejectment, that's the trigger that starts the clock for adverse possession. And then an adverse possessor gains title to the occupied real property when that statute of limitations that was triggered by the action that gave right to a cause of ejectment expires. So these are interlocking definitions. Adverse possessor has to do something that triggers a right of ejectment. That starts the clock for adverse possession. And then once the statutory period is over, the adverse possessor gains title to the occupied real property. At any moment up until that statute of limitations expires, the real property owner has the right to eject the adverse possessor. And in New York, that period is 10 years. So for 10 years, the property owner has the right to eject an adverse possessor. And it's only if the property owner does not act for that 10-year period that the adverse possessor gains title to the occupied real property. Now let's talk about what the consequences are of this statute of limitations expiring. Once title is acquired by adverse possession, the adverse possessor is the owner in every way we think about ownership. The adverse possessor can sell the land, can pass it to their heirs, or leave it via will, can otherwise transfer it, can give it to somebody, can mortgage it, can lease it, can use it, etc. And once title vests by adverse possession, as we saw in Hammond v. Baker, right, even if the adverse possession law changes later on, that doesn't disturb the title that has already passed to the adverse possessor. Now, the adverse possessor, after the statutory period, is going to need to go to court to get themselves declared the owner before they're going to be able to do these things, because no bank is going to lend them money without some kind of a clear title to the land. So once the period has passed, the adverse possessor can go into court and bring an action to quiet title, to say, title of this property belongs to me. I need a court declaration that can then be recorded in the property record so that it's clear to anybody who looks who the owner is. Okay, that's the end of video 1. Video 2 and 3 will go much more into the mechanics of adverse possession, but I hope that this has been helpful in some fashion to you.